Hello everyone, I'm Tobias Helms. I'm a specialist for the archaeology of Southwestern Asia. I'm currently based at Mainz University and I'm also a case study author in InsSciDE's Heritage Work Package. Today I present parts of my study which focuses on a strike at a German excavation in Syria back in 1963. As an academic discipline, Near Eastern archaeology took shape during the era of European colonialism and imperialism. The hunt of artifacts became a competitive matter of national pride. Spectacular archaeological finds were brought back to Europe as tokens of scholarly achievement, put on display in the museums of Western capitals. Early archaeologists working in the Near East were also often directly involved in politics, diplomatic as well as military affairs and intelligence activities. Max Freiherr von Oppenheim, who discovered the site of Tell Chuera, might serve as an example. During the First World War, he wrote intelligence reports and tried to mobilize Muslim populations against the British by stirring up religious sentiments. The entanglement between archaeology and politics during the era of colonialism asks for a critical perspective on our research practice. To what degree are modern field archaeology and other academic disciplines doing field research in the Near East perpetuating neo-colonial attitudes and implementing exploitative labor practices ultimately rooted in colonialist culture? While archaeological research during the era of colonialism has become the subject of critical reflection, the continuation of colonial practices by Near Eastern archaeologists during the colonial period and today has been studied to a far lesser extent or, as some have argued, even been largely ignored. In my presentation, I will laser focus on one particular event, a 5-day-long strike at a German excavation in northeastern Syria in October 1963. I will begin by introducing the excavators and their project. Next, I will address the working conditions at the site and the organization of the workforce during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Then I will talk about conflicts between the archaeologists and their locally hired workers, before moving on to the events surrounding the strike of '63. To conclude, I will ask whether the response by the German excavation team to the strike attests to a chain of events slipping out of control, or if they must be understood as an example of neo-colonialist conduct. Here, I will argue on the basis of the premise that colonial practices are not limited to actions ensuring political and economic dominance abroad. They can continue to have an effect after the dissolution of colonial regimes, manifesting, for example, on the level of discursive practices or in the ways how people encountered are perceived and treated. The events unfolded at the archaeological site of Tell Chuera. Chuera is a major excavation site located in the northeast of Syria. During the Syrian civil war, fighters of the so-called Islamic State briefly controlled the area. Then the region around Chuera came under Kurdish control. This period of relative stability ended when Turkish-backed militias seized territory in northeastern Syria during the Operation Peace Spring in 2019. The site of Tell Chuera is best known for archaeological remains from the 3rd millennium BCE. During this time period, the site developed into an important urban settlement. With interruptions, Chuera was explored by German archaeologists since 1958. However, with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, archaeological fieldwork at the site came to an abrupt halt. In June 2015, the excavation house and the guardsman's house were air raided by the US-led International Coalition Against ISIS. At this point, the dig house allegedly served as a retreat for IS militants. The destruction of the extended storage depot for archaeological finds, our labs, and the guardsman's home are a case of collateral damage. The bombing of Chuera is a reminder that it is all too convenient to attribute the destructions of archaeological heritage in the war-torn regions of Syria and Iraq solely to the machinations of Islamist militants. Until the Civil War made the exploration of Chuera impossible, I've been involved in the investigation of the site during the 2000s. While working on my PhD thesis, I was able to access the field records of the early German excavations. This sparked my interest in the research history of the site. The notes were compiled by Anton Mortgart, who directed the excavations at Chuera between 1958 and 1976, and his team, chiefly his wife, Dr. Ursula Mortgart-Correns. These field notes, which include daily reports on the progress of the excavation work, are my main source for reconstructing the events around the strike of 1963. The documents became accessible for research purposes only in 2008, when they were digitized at Frankfurt University within the framework of the Mortgart Archive project. They are of great value for every archaeologist interested in the site today. At the same time, the field diaries provide insight on the logistics and social dynamics of the expeditions, since they also contain brief accounts of daily work procedures. At this point, I would like to briefly talk about Anton Mortgart, who, as was mentioned before, directed the excavations during the period addressed in this paper. Anton Mortgart was born in 1897 in Belgium and trained as classical archaeologist. He moved to Berlin in the 1930s. Interesting move. In 1948, Mortgart was offered the newly established professorship for Near Eastern Archaeology, Vorderasiatische Archäologie, at the Freie Universität Berlin. Now, his influence on the newly established discipline can hardly be overestimated, at least with regard to the situation in Germany. Mortgart trained a whole generation of archaeologists, the so-called Mortgart-Schule, Mortgart School. Members of the Mortgart School came to dominate the newly established discipline in post-war Germany for decades to come. In this regard, Mortgart can be rightly considered as the founding figure of Near Eastern archaeology as an academic discipline and university subject in Germany. Whenever I talk of the Mortgarts in the following, I do this deliberately to underline the importance of Ursula Mortgart-Correns' contribution to the project. Although the discoveries at the site have become largely associated with the name of her husband, it is clear from the original field documentation that she played an important and I feel largely underestimated role in organizing the logistics of the expedition, and even more so with regard to the actual field research on site. Overall, the work of the Mortgarts was pioneering. When they started exploring the ruins of Chuera, northern Syria was, with the exception of a handful of sites, archaeological terra incognita. On the other hand, their methodological approach to field archaeology was subpar, even by the standards of their time. When the Mortgarts started to excavate the site, they were confronted with major logistical challenges. Back then, the infrastructure of the region was hardly developed. The surroundings of the site were only sparsely populated by, quote, semi-nomads, Halbnomaden, which Anton Mortgart identified as ethnic Arabs, Bedouins, and Kurds. Back then, the government of the short-lived United Arab Republic actively pushed the population of the North Syrian plains, whose subsistence often relied on mobile pastoralism, into adopting agricultural production and sedentary life. Already during their first excavation in 1958, the Mortgarts hired a workforce of up to 150 workers. In the following year, an even larger workforce of about 200 workers was employed, among them a larger group of Kurdish villages from north of Aleppo. For a long time, the employment of scores of day laborers who worked under a small number of supervisors was a typical feature of archaeological expeditions throughout the Near and Middle East. The Mortgarts followed this tradition. Nowadays, the amassing of such enormous excavation workforces is criticized for at least two reasons. On the one hand, the practice hampered a careful exposure of archaeological remains, which inevitably led to a loss of data. Moreover, it has been argued that this way of organizing labor, which was usually accompanied by a military-style organization of the workforce, alienated the excavation workers from the scientific project and the unearthed heritage. The Mortgarts also hired migrant workers from the Haran region in southeastern Syria. At the beginning of the excavations, the Haranis and Kurdish villages formed the core of the workforce. However, Over that time, the Germans increasingly turned to recruit workers among the local population. Their field notes suggest they found recruitment of local workers to be, quote, difficult at times. In 1959, for example, recruitment was only accomplished with the help of two local community leaders, Sheikhs, and the paramilitary desert police, Wüstenpolizei. I suspect that the restricted number of job opportunities at the archaeological dig led to tensions among local families. Competition for the available vacancies might have been particularly high, given that in the years between 1958 and 1961, the whole region was affected by a series of devastating droughts, which led to crop failure and the perishing of whole herds of livestock. When the Mortgart started excavating, the whole region was a restricted military area. The police summoned to the site of the excavation on recruitment day was stationed in Tell Chuera, a small village located about 10 kilometers to the south of Chuera. As we will see, the relationship between the Germans and the paramilitary police becomes important in connection with the strike of '63 a few years later. In the excavation files of the Mortgart's excavations, the hired workers are often listed according to their origin and alleged ethnic affiliation. On site, groups of workers were also tasked in accordance to this division. Teenagers and children were also employed on a regular basis. The workers were grouped into units of about 8 to 13 persons. The whole system was optimized to excavate impressively large areas of the site in a relatively short span of time, at the expense of archaeological accuracy. In 1960, the Mortgarts also managed to ship a Feldbahn railway and tipper wagons to northeastern Syria. Beginning with the fourth field season, the year of the strike, rails were laid out across the site. In the following years, the system significantly improved the capability of moving large quantities of excavation spoil. From the first field season onwards, conflicts between the German team and the workers, as well as among the workforce, are attested in the field diaries of the expedition. From the archaeologist's point of view, conflicts mostly resulted from situations in which workers engaged in deliberately avoiding or slowing down work procedures, for example by hiding baskets used for removing the excavation spoil. Occasionally, the files contain evidence for arguments between the workers and the archaeologists regarding the level of payment. There are also examples of small groups of workers who reacted to the dismissal of co-workers by downing their tools in solidarity. A particularly serious incident occurred during the first field season when two groups of workers, locals and townspeople from Raqqa, clashed. In the course of the event, a man from Raqqa was bludgeoned with an iron tool and got badly injured. According to the narrative of the field notes, it seems that dissent was mainly an issue between the German team and the local component of the workforce. Regarding wage bargaining and negotiations with the German employers, I assume that the workers hired in the immediate surroundings of the site felt in a slightly advantageous position as compared to the workers hired from other places in Syria, simply because the latter were staying in the camp with the Germans and were therefore more dependent on them. Some conflict among the workers occurred between groups of different origin and was probably catalyzed by group solidarity and competition for job opportunities along the line locals versus non-locals. A firm protectionist stance on the local population against the employment of non-local workers is also something I witnessed myself when working at the site in the 2000s. Now, to enforce discipline on site, the Mortgarts brought in community leaders as mediators, appointed foremen, issued warnings, punished workers with spontaneous wage cuts, and implemented a hire and fire approach. The dismissal of workers was sometimes countered by ad hoc solidarity strikes of co-workers, but limited to the immediate peers of the persons concerned and were apparently never supported by larger groups of workers. That is to say, at least until '63. During the strike of '63, to which I will turn now, some of the workers were subjected to tougher measures than wage cuts. In 1963, the German team worked in 3 areas. Besides the Mortgarts, Bartel Ruder and Johannes Böse joined the team as archaeologists. Architects, a medical doctor, and Mr. Kamel Shehade, the appointed representative of the Syrian government, also joined the expedition. On October 8, right after the weekly payments of wages, Dr. Ursula Mortgart-Correns noticed unrest among the workers assigned to her excavation area, Kleiner Antentempel. She notes down that the payment itself went without significant complications, which implies the volatility of this weekly routine, but that there was talk among the workers about demanding higher wages. Mortgart-Correns' entry ends with a rather confident appeal. Let's not worry about what tomorrow will bring. Meanwhile, Dr. Ruder, who supervises the excavations in another area of the site, is clearly more concerned. During the payment of the workers, he perceives, quote, first signs of a revolution. To me, this description of the workers' discontent with the level of pay as a portent of revolutionary action seems not only exaggerated. Ruder's wording also implies that he understood the very idea of the workers downing the tool as challenge of the given order of things at the excavation. On the next day, just a couple of workers show up at Ruder's excavation site. At Mortgart-Correns' trench, only a foreman appears and leaves again as none of the workers are showing up. At breakfast, some children staying with Dr. Mortgart-Correns in the trench inform her that 2 Bedouins had come to the site, allegedly to destroy the edges of freshly excavated mud brick walls. The deliberate damaging of the excavated structures could be interpreted as an act of either vandalism or sabotage. In any case, the destruction underlines the situation in which these particular individuals were alienated from the object of their work. On October 9, the majority of the locally hired workforce goes on strike. For the first time, the stoppage was not an entirely spontaneous reaction to something that happened on site, for example, the dismissal of co-workers. Now it seems that there was at least a basic level of coordination among the workers. The timing of the strike is interesting. Retrospectively, Anton Mortgart noted in his published field report that in 1963 it had been particularly difficult to hire a sufficiently large numbers of workers. Compared to the situation during the drought years of 1958 to 61, there was less competition for a position as a day laborer at the dig. The workforce had also become more homogeneous, with locals identified as Bedouins now accounting for the majority of the employees. It is quite conceivable that given the labor shortage of '63, a critical number of workers felt simply less dispensable and believed themselves to be in a stronger bargaining position to demand a better payment and raising other claims. Dr. Ruder identifies 3 workers as agitators and notes in his field diary that the Germans called the police, supposedly to prevent workers from damaging the expedition's property, which they, one should add, never did. In Dr. Mortgart-Correns' account, the German team found out that 3 workmen had confiscated all toolboxes after the payment of the weekly salaries on October 8. They allegedly did so against the will of some of the workers and told everyone under threats not to show up for work tomorrow. Besides the demand for higher wages, the strike obviously aimed at dismissing an individual named Jahes from the workforce. So far, I have not managed to reconstruct the reasons for the tensions between at least some of the workers and Jahes. It is interesting, though, that Jahes was one of Mortgart's railway men. The Feldbahn was assembled for the first time in 1963 and, according to Anton Mortgart's accounts, considerably sped up the process of removing the spoil from the excavations. Possibly this was not to everyone's liking. Ursula Mortgart-Correns also informs us that foremen and the portion of the workforce identified as Kurds did not join the strike, highlighting the importance of group cohesiveness in the context of the events. The strike, as it appears, was a Bedouin affair. On October 10th, the second day of the strike, the situation escalates. The military police, which the Germans had summoned to the excavation site, arrests the 3 workers identified as strike leaders. In his notes, Dr. Ruder describes the 3 workers as Redelsführer, ringleaders. Similarly to the usage of the term revolution the day before, Ruder uses an odd term one would rather expect in the context of counterinsurgency than in a situation where a group of day laborers doesn't show up to work. The 3 detained Bedouins were shortly brought to the police station at InsSciDE, where they were imprisoned overnight. Regarding the events on October 10, it is important to point out that the detainees found themselves in a precarious situation. When European archaeologists cause the arrest by police of members of the local community in many Middle Eastern countries, chances are that the detainees will be subjected to a rough treatment, for example beatings, harmful interrogation methods or worse. This would be a likely scenario when working in some countries today, and there is no reason to assume that this would have been any different in 1960 Syria, especially in a region under military jurisdiction with the paramilitary police force involved on one side and members of a politically and socio-economically marginalized community, the Bedouins, on the other side. Conducting scientific field research in any given country where a distortion of the public order is likely to be answered by excessive repression through police forces or the Secret Service requires the responsible understanding on the part of the incoming researchers. The involvement of law enforcement agencies can have dire consequences for members of the host community. This is especially crucial wherever European researchers hire local workforces and therefore become actors within the local economy. The German team working at Tell Chuera clearly failed to shoulder this responsibility. It is not possible to assess the role of individual InsSciDE policemen who might have also pushed for the detention. Yet turning to the police force in order to prevent the fallout of the strike attests to either complete ignorance of the impending consequences for the workers or a willingness to ensure the continuation of the excavation works by any means necessary. This said, calling the police to deal with the emergent strike was definitely not the only option available to the German team at this point. The team could have entered direct negotiations with the workers or asked community leaders to act as mediators, as they had done before in 1959, when they encountered difficulties during the assignment of workers. It is clear from Ruder's field notes that he begins to feel uncomfortable about the situation, as he apparently asks the police not to punish the man too severely. Here the question one ought to ask is, of course, punishment for what? For refusing to work? For allegedly pressuring fellow workers to hide their tools away? On this day, risk to safety was taken so seriously that 2 soldiers from InsSciDE were deployed to guard the dig house overnight. On October 11, the third day of the strike, Dr. Ruder is assigned to drive the 2 soldiers back to Tell InsSciDE. On arrival at the police station, he is asked to transport the tied-up prisoners to the border town of Tel Abyad, since the police officers lacked means of transportation. Now Anton Mortgart, the director of Excavations, intervenes and asks the military police to not punish the men too harshly. Eventually he managed to convince the policemen in charge not to bring the workers to Tel Abyad, but to transport them to the nearby village of Nus Tel instead. It remains unclear what happened next. Most likely the three men were simply handed over to another police station or the mayor of Mustel. Certainly a transfer to Tel Abyad would have meant more trouble for them. What remains from my point of view is the disturbing image of a German archaeologist, Ruder, who later became professor for Near Eastern Archaeology in Munich, driving a car through northern Syria with three tied-up workers on the backseat. However one interprets the events surrounding the strike of 1963, the detention of the three workers marks a low point in the interaction and relationship between the German archaeologists and the local community, who constituted, let's be frank, their main pool for cheap labor. The strike dragged on for 2 days, with only the Kurds and some non-Bedouins continuing to participate in the excavation work. On October 14, the workers finally caved in and resumed working. To drive home their authority, the excavation team dismissed the ringleaders, which implies they had been released from police custody at that point, alongside some other, quote, bad workers. It does not seem that the strike affected the excavation any further. Later on, the events are never mentioned again, not in the field diaries nor in the published reports. Against the backdrop of the long history of exploring the site, the 5-day strike of '63 was only a brief episode. One could certainly oppose the narrative of a situation in which the control over the events simply slipped out of the hands of the archaeologists. What I propose here in contrast is that the archaeologists' reaction to the strike, culminating in the intervention of the military police and the incarceration of workers, is reminiscent of colonial practices of earlier periods of archaeological research in the wider region, when locally hired workers were often subjected to exploitative labor conditions. Hence, the approach of the German team features elements of a neo-colonial approach to field archaeology. What to take from this for future endeavors? I think that future field research in the Middle East, and here I'm not talking exclusively about archaeology, of course, must increase its awareness of practices rooted in the colonial past of European research abroad. The decolonization of research agendas is not only a matter of history and concerns more than, say, the restitution of certain artifacts from European museum collections. Decolonization must integrate a critical reflection on the process of knowledge production itself, as well as labor conditions, wherever incoming researchers also act as employers. Field research abroad necessitates a forward-looking analysis of the interests of all actors involved in collaborative projects. While interests can perfectly match on the level of research collaborations, that is to say on paper, they might diverge significantly in reality. So thank you very much for listening to my paper, and I'm looking forward to take any questions and discuss with you.